Have you ever felt trapped by circumstances beyond your control, watching helplessly as life passes you by? This is the story of a man who endured the unthinkable chained inside an iron cage for years, forgotten by the world until nature itself intervened in the most unexpected way. When the river that had witnessed his suffering finally rose in a historic flood, it didn't just bring destruction, it brought his salvation. The surging waters bent the rusted bars that had imprisoned him, creating an opening just wide enough for escape. What happened next will restore your faith in the power of hope and the mysterious ways freedom finds us. This incredible true story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, liberation can come from the most unlikely sources. The morning patrol boat cut through the mist like a knife through silk, its engine purring softly in the pre-dawn quiet. Officer Chen had made this same journey along the riverbank for 3 years, checking for illegal fishing nets and monitoring water levels. But this morning, something caught his eye that made him cut the engine entirely. There, partially obscured by overgrown reeds and morning fog, stood an iron structure he'd passed countless times before. He'd always assumed it was an old flood gauge or abandoned equipment from the colonial era. But today, something moved inside it. Chen rubbed his eyes, certain the mist was playing tricks. He guided his boat closer, the hull scraping against the muddy bank. As the fog parted, his breath caught in his throat. Inside the rusted iron cage, barely distinguishable from the shadows and metal, was a human figure. The man, if he could still be called that, sat motionless in the corner of the cage, his skin so darkened by sun and dirt that he seemed part of the structure itself. His hair, gray and matted, hung past his shoulders in thick, tangled ropes. When Chen called out, the figure's head turned slowly, mechanically, as if remembering how movement worked. 2 eyes, startlingly clear despite everything, fixed on Chen. They held neither hope nor despair, just a vacant acknowledgement of another human presence. The officer's hands shook as he reached for his radio, his voice cracking as he called for backup and medical assistance. Within an hour, the quiet riverbank transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Police vehicles lined the muddy path, their lights cutting through the lifting fog. Paramedics stood ready with stretchers and equipment, though they kept their distance, unsure how to approach. A crowd of villagers gathered, their morning routines forgotten. "I've walked past here every day for 15 years, whispered Mrs. Liu, the village teacher, her face pale with shock. "Every single day on my way to school. How did we not know?" Old man Zhang, who'd fished these waters since childhood, shook his head slowly. "We knew the cage was there. My grandfather told stories about it, said it was from the warlord days. But empty, always empty. Just a reminder of crueler times." The rescue team worked carefully, their cutting tools sending showers of sparks. As they attacked the ancient lock, the man inside watched without emotion, as if this too was just another day in his endless captivity. When they finally pried open the door, he didn't move. He'd forgotten that movement was a choice he could make. It took 2 officers to help him stand. His legs, thin as bamboo poles, buckled immediately. They carried him out, his body weighing no more than a child's. In the full light of morning, his condition became horrifyingly clear. Scars crisscrossed his exposed skin. His fingernails had grown into yellowed claws. The rags that served as clothing disintegrated at the slightest touch. Dr. Wei, the district medical officer, performed a preliminary examination on site. Severe malnutrition, multiple old fractures, extensive scarring. She murmured to her assistant, trying to maintain professional detachment. "But alive. God knows how, but alive." The man's lips moved, producing no sound at first. Then, a whisper, so faint it might have been wind through the reeds. "River told me ... today." As they loaded him into the ambulance, Chen noticed something that would haunt him for years. The man's wrists and ankles bore deep grooves where shackles had rested so long they'd worn permanent channels in his flesh. This wasn't just imprisonment, this was something far crueler. The investigation began immediately. Police combed through old records, searching for any mention of the cage or its occupant. They found nothing official, just fragments of local memory and half-remembered stories. The cage itself bore no identifying marks, its construction suggesting it dated back at least 40 years. As news spread, journalists arrived from the provincial capital. Their cameras captured the rusted cage against the peaceful river backdrop, a jarring reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty. But the real story, who this man was, why he'd been imprisoned, how he'd survived, remained a mystery. In the hospital, surrounded by the clean white walls and soft beds he'd dreamed of for so long, the man began to speak. Slowly, painfully, in a voice unused to forming words, he started to tell his story. The nurses leaned in, tears streaming down their faces as they realized they were hearing a tale of endurance that defied belief. He spoke of a life before the chains, of a time when he walked free under the open sky, when he had a name, a purpose, a future stretching ahead like an open road. Before the cage, before the chains, before the endless days blurred into one long nightmare. There was a man named Wei Mings. He lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Chengzhou, where morning glory vines climbed the garden walls, and his wife Shaoli sang while hanging laundry in the courtyard. Ming's was a traveling merchant, specializing in traditional medicines and herbs. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it provided enough to keep his family comfortable. His two children, Lin, age 7, and little May, just 4, would race to the gate whenever they heard his cartwheels on the gravel path. Knowing their father's return meant stories from distant villages and small treats hidden in his pockets. "Papa, home," May would shriek, her pigtails bouncing as she ran. Lin, trying to act more mature, would walk quickly but with dignity, though his eyes shone with the same excitement. These homecomings were the highlight of Ming's journeys, making every hard mile worthwhile. Shaoli understood the demands of his trade. The best herbs grew in remote mountain villages, and the most profitable customers lived in distant towns. She packed his travel bag with practiced efficiency: dried meat, rice balls, a change of clothes, and always, without fail, a small cloth pouch containing locks of the children's hair. "So we travel with you," she'd say, pressing it into his palm. The fateful journey began like any other. It was early autumn, the harvest season, when mountain villages needed medicines for the hard work ahead and had fresh crops to trade. Ming's planned a 3-week circuit through the eastern provinces, a route he'd traveled dozens of times before. On the morning of his departure, May clung to his leg. "Don't want Papa to go," she mumbled into his knee. He knelt down, smoothing her hair. "Little butterfly, Papa will bring you back something special. What would you like?" Her tears stopped as she considered this seriously. "A pretty stone," she decided, "the shiniest one you can find." He promised to find the shiniest stone in all of China, kissed Shaoli goodbye, and set off with his cart creaking under its load of medicines. The last image he carried was his family, waving from the gate, Shaoli holding May's hand, while Lin stood tall beside them, trying to look like the man of the house. The first week passed uneventfully. Ming's made good trades in the mountain villages, exchanging his medicines for rare herbs and enough coin to make the journey profitable. He found a piece of river-polished jade that would make May squeal with delight, and a small carved wooden soldier for Lin. It was in the borderlands between provinces where everything went wrong. These were lawless territories, where local warlords held more power than distant government officials. Ming's had always been careful here, staying on main roads and avoiding travel after dark. But a bridge washout forced him onto unfamiliar paths. He entered the town of Haishui as evening fell, planning only to find lodging for the night. The streets were strangely empty, shops shuttered despite the early hour. He should have trusted his instincts and left immediately, but fatigue and the promise of a real bed clouded his judgment. The incident happened so fast he barely understood it. Shouts erupted from a tea-house. A man stumbled out, bleeding from a head wound, and collapsed at Ming's feet. Without thinking, Ming's knelt to help, pressing his travel cloth against the man's wound. That's when the soldiers appeared. "Murder," someone shouted. "He killed Secretary Feng." Before Ming's could explain, before he could even stand, rifle butts drove him to the ground. They found the dead man's blood on his hands, his merchant's knife in his belt. The fact that the blade was clearly meant for cutting herbs, not flesh, mattered nothing. The trial, if it could be called that, took place the next morning in the warlord's compound. Lord Chen presided from a raised platform, a thin man with dead eyes who listened to the testimony with visible boredom. The real killer had fled in the night. The town needed someone to blame. A traveling merchant with no local connections was perfect. Ming's tried to speak, to explain, to beg them to send word to his family. The guard struck him each time he opened his mouth. When they pronounced the sentence death by cageing, he didn't understand. Execution he could comprehend, but caging, they dragged him to the riverbank where the iron cage waited. It stood 6 feet tall and 4 feet square, its bars thick as a man's wrist. The construction was diabolic in its simplicity, too short to stand upright, too narrow to lie down, open to every element. A small slot at the bottom allowed for occasional food and water. As they forced him inside, locking shackles around his wrists and ankles, the guards explained with cruel satisfaction, Lord Chen's special punishment. "You'll wish for death, but it won't come. You'll live as long as the river permits." The door clanged shut with finality. The lock, massive and rust-free, clicked into place, and there, with the river whispering past just feet away, Ming's new existence began. He screamed until his voice broke, rattled the bars until his hands bled, called for justice until he realized no one was listening. That first night, as rain began to fall through the bars, he clutched the small pouch containing his children's hair and understood that he would never see them again. The cage stood on iron posts, driven deep into the riverbank, its base 3 feet above the ground, high enough to prevent escape by digging, low enough that passers-by could see the prisoner's humiliation. Every bar was welded solidly, every joint reinforced. Warlord's metal workers had perfected their craft through years of cruel innovation. Ming spent his first days testing every inch of his prison. He pushed against each bar, searching for weakness. He examined every weld, every bolt, every possible flaw. His merchant's mind, trained to spot imperfections in goods, found nothing. The cage was built to outlast its occupant. The construction forced him into a perpetual crouch. Standing fully meant pressing his head against the top bars. Sitting meant drawing his knees to his chest. Lying down was impossible. He could only curl on his side in a fetal position. Within days, his muscles began to cramp continuously. Within weeks, his spine started its slow, permanent curve. The shackles were their own torment. Heavy iron cuffs, connected by short chains, allowed minimal movement. The metal bit into his flesh, rubbing raw wounds that never healed properly. When he tried to find comfortable positions, the chains tangled, forcing him to remain still until guards came with their poles to untangle him. Usually while laughing. Food came irregularly through the bottom slot. Moldy rice, rotting vegetables, scraps even dogs would refuse. Water was poured through the bars, most of it splashing onto the ground. He learned to position himself to catch what he could in his mouth. Dignity abandoned in the face of survival. Sometimes villagers threw fruit, pits, or bones at him. Children dared each other to get close enough to poke him with sticks. The guards, young soldiers serving the warlord, treated him as entertainment. They made bets on how long he'd survive, whether he'd beg for death, when he'd stop speaking entirely. Some showed flickers of pity, sneaking extra water on burning summer days. Others delighted in cruelty, urinating on him through the bars or prodding him awake when he managed to doze. But the cage's true torture was exposure to the elements. The first storm taught him what real suffering meant. Rain fell in sheets, driven horizontal by wind. With nowhere to shelter, he could only huddle as water streamed over him. The temperature dropped rapidly. His thin clothes, soaked through, offered no protection. He shivered so violently the chains rattled continuously, a metallic chattering that merged with his clicking teeth. When morning came, he was hypothermic, barely conscious. The guards found him blue-lipped and unresponsive. They debated whether to report his death, but Lord Chen's orders were specific. The prisoner must survive as long as naturally possible. They threw buckets of river water on him until he stirred, then left him to recover on his own. He survived that first storm, and the next, and hundreds after. His body pushed beyond normal limits, adapted in ways that seemed impossible. He learned to sense whether changes ours in advance, positioning himself to minimize exposure. He discovered that pressing against certain bars during rain created small dry spots. He found that controlling his breathing during the worst cold could preserve precious body heat. The cage revealed its seasonal cruelties in turn. Winter brought more than cold, it brought frost that formed on the bars and on him. He woke many mornings to find his hair frozen to the metal, requiring painful tearing to free himself. His fingers and toes went numb, turned black, somehow healed enough to face the next freeze. Snow piled around the cage's base, sometimes rising high enough that he sat in it, the cold seeping through his bones. But winter wasn't the worst. Summer transformed the cage into an oven. The iron bars absorbed heat until they burned to touch. The metal platform beneath him became unbearable. He could only shift position constantly, never finding relief. The sun, reflecting off the river, created a double assault of brightness and heat. His skin blistered, peeled, blistered again. Dehydration became a constant companion. During one particularly brutal heat wave, he began hallucinating. The river spoke to him in his daughter's voice. The reeds became his wife, swaying in the wind, reaching toward him. He conversed with these visions for days, finding comfort in madness. When the heat finally broke, he mourned the loss of their company. More than he celebrated the cooler air. The guards changed with the seasons too. The winter crew built fires just out of reach, taunting him with warmth. Summer guards set up awnings for themselves, eating melons and fanning themselves while he baked. They marked time by his deterioration, making notes in their logs. Prisoners, hair now completely white, can no longer stand fully, no longer speaks. Through it all, the river remained constant. High in spring, low in autumn, frozen at edges in winter, warm and sluggish in summer. He watched debris float past branches. Dead animals, occasional boats whose occupants carefully avoided looking at the cage. He memorized the river's every mood, every sound, every smell. It became his calendar, his clock, his only friend. His first year ended marked by the return of spring floods. Mings realized he'd stopped hoping for rescue. His family believed him dead by now. No one was searching. The merchant Wei Mings had vanished. Only the caged animal remained, learning, through each passing season, new depths of endurance and new definitions of suffering. The first winter nearly killed him. The second broke his mind. By the third, something strange happened. He began to survive, not by fighting the cage, but by accepting it. His world shrank to the dimensions of iron bars, and within that world, he found rhythms of endurance previously unimaginable. His body transformed in grotesque ways. His spine curved permanently from the forced crouch. His muscles atrophied until movement became mechanical, limited. The chains had worn grooves so deep in his wrists and ankles that the bones showed through in places. His hair grew wild and matted, providing slight insulation. His nails became claws, useful for catching the insects that ventured too close. The guards watched this transformation with fascination and revulsion. "He's becoming something else," one young soldier whispered. "Not human anymore." They stopped. Tormenting him as sport, there was no satisfaction in prodding something that no longer reacted with human emotion. He'd learned that stillness brought less pain than struggle. Silence, less torment than pleading. He developed systems for survival. Rainwater collected in his cupped palms, in the hollows of his collarbone, in his mouth held open to the sky. He learned to catch fish that swam too close during floods, eating them raw, bones and all. Insects became protein. River grass pulled through the bars provided vegetation. His digestive system adapted to things that would have killed him in his former life. The seasons began to blur. Was this his 4th winter, or 5th? Had 7 summers passed, or 8? Time lost meaning when every day was survival, every night, endurance. He stopped counting after realizing that knowing the duration of his imprisonment only added psychological torture to the physical. His captors changed regularly. New guards arrived, full of horror at their assignment, gradually hardening to the reality of maintaining a human in a cage. Some lasted months, others only weeks. The cage outlasted them all, its occupant a constant while the world around him shifted. One guard, an older man named Zhang, showed more curiosity than cruelty. During his night watches, he would sit near the cage, smoking his pipe. "How do you do it?" he asked once. "How do you continue?" The prisoner's response was a look that held depths Zhang couldn't fathom. After that, Zhang brought extra water, occasionally dropped meat within reach. Small mercies in a merciless situation. The cage began to break him in ways he hadn't anticipated. His voice, unused, began to disappear. First, he stopped screaming, there was no point. Then he stopped speaking to the guards. Eventually, he lost the ability to form words at all. When he tried, only rasps emerged. Language, that fundamental human trait, abandoned him. But as words left, something else emerged. He began to understand the world through different senses. The river's sound told him weather patterns days in advance. Bird calls warned of approaching storms. The color of the water predicted floods or droughts. He read the environment like his fellow merchants once read ledgers. Madness came in waves. During the worst times, he held conversations with memories. His wife sat beside the cage, young and beautiful as on their wedding day. His children played in the reeds, always just out of reach. He told them stories, sang them lullabies in his cracked voice. These hallucinations were mercy moments of escape from the relentless reality. The local villagers created legends around him. Mothers threatened misbehaving children. Be good, or you'll end up like the caged ghost. Young men dared each other to approach at night, when his eyes glowed in the darkness like an animal's. Some claimed he was a demon, others a saint being tested by heaven. None saw him as what he was, a man enduring the unendurable. Religious pilgrims occasionally stopped, leaving offerings outside the cage's reach. They believed suffering this profound must have spiritual meaning. They prayed for him, or to him. Unable to distinguish between prisoner and prophet, he watched them with eyes that had seen too much, understanding that their need to find meaning in his torture was its own form of human cruelty. Officials came twice over the years. The first time a regional inspector toured the borderlands, he stood before the cage, handkerchief pressed to his nose, and declared the punishment regrettable but legal under local jurisdiction. The second visit came years later. New magistrate, horrified by what he found, but the warlord's influence remained strong. The magistrate left, and the cage remained. Nature marked time more honestly than humans. Trees near the riverbank grew tall, their shade occasionally granting relief. Floods carved new channels, changing the river's course slightly, but never enough to threaten the cage. Bird generations nested in the same spots, teaching their young to avoid the strange creature in iron. He became part of the landscape, as permanent as the rocks, as overlooked as the reeds. Farmers worked fields within sight of the cage, no longer noticing. Fishermen cast nets nearby, their children playing on the banks. The cage just another fixture of their world. The extraordinary horror of a human in perpetual imprisonment became ordinary through repetition, yet through it all, he endured. Not through hope. Hope had died years ago. Not through hatred that required more energy than survival allowed. He endured through something more fundamental, the simple, inexplicable refusal of life to extinguish itself. Each breath was rebellion, each heartbeat defiance. Each day survived was testimony that humans could adapt to anything, even if the cost was humanity itself. As winter melted into spring for the 4th time, the river spoke. Not in words he'd lost those long ago, but in the language of currents and tides, in the whispers of water against stone. He'd spent so many hours watching its flow that he knew every ripple, every eddy, every mood of its ancient passage. The river had been his only constant companion through the seasons of agony. When guards changed shifts, the river remained. When his body failed him, the river continued its journey. When madness took him, the river's voice called him back. It neither judged nor pitied, it simply flowed, eternal and indifferent, yet somehow comforting in its permanence. He began his conversations with simple observations, voiceless thoughts directed at the water. High today, he would think when spring floods swelled the banks. Angry, when storms churned its surface brown with silt. The river never answered, but he sensed acknowledgement in the way light played on its surface. In the rhythm of waves against the shore, local legends said, this river was sacred, home to dragon spirits and water gods. Fishermen left offerings on full moon nights, rice wine poured into the current, flowers scattered on the surface. From his cage, he watched these rituals with the detachment of someone observing from another world. The fishermen never looked at him. He was less real than their invisible gods. During his 5th summer, drought dropped the water level drastically. The river's bed revealed itself ancient stones, discarded pottery, bones of unknown origin. He studied these exposed secrets, finding strange comfort in evidence that the river had swallowed many histories. His suffering was just another sediment layer in its timeless flow. Wildlife treated him as part of the landscape. Herons fished within arm's reach, no longer startled by his presence. River otters played in the shallows, their cubs investigating the cage bars with fearless curiosity. A water snake made its nest in the reeds beside his prison, raising multiple generations in his shadow. He envied their freedom but felt kinship with their survival instincts. The hallucinations evolved from torment to companionship. The river took forms, sometimes his daughter May, splashing in the shallows, her laughter mixing with bird calls. Sometimes his wife, washing clothes on the bank, humming old songs. He knew they weren't real but cherished their visits. Madness, he discovered, could be a gift when reality offered only suffering. One autumn night, with the full moon reflecting off the water like scattered silver coins, the river revealed something profound. He realized he hadn't thought of escape in over a year. The cage had become his world so completely that the concept of outside had faded. This recognition should have brought despair. Instead, it brought an odd peace. Acceptance, even of horror, carried its own freedom, but the river wouldn't let him surrender entirely. During spring floods, it rose high enough to lap at the cage floor, bringing gifts: a child's wooden toy, probably dropped upstream, a piece of cloth that might have been silk, once impossibly a flower still fresh. These tokens reminded him that a world existed beyond iron bars, that life continued its dance while he remained frozen. He developed rituals around the river's gifts. The wooden toy he kept until termites claimed it, holding it during the worst nights. The cloth became a head covering during brutal summer heat. The flower he consumed petal by petal, the first fresh vegetation he'd tasted in years. Each piece a sacrament of memory and loss. The river's wildlife became his calendar. Crane migrations marked autumn's arrival. Spawning fish announced spring. Dragonfly swarms predicted summer storms. He learned to read nature's patterns with accuracy that would have amazed his former self. The merchant who once consulted printed almanacs now divined seasons from ripples and bird flight. During his 7th year, or was it 8th, monsoon rains raised the river to unprecedented heights. Water rose past the cage floor, past his knees, reaching his chest. For the first time in years, he felt genuine fear. Not of death, that fear had long passed, but of losing his strange equilibrium with suffering. Drowning would end his dialogue with the river, interrupt their wordless communion. But the water receded, leaving him mud-caked but alive. In the flood's aftermath, he noticed something crucial. The constant water pressure had loosened one of the corner posts. Not enough for escape, the cage still stood firm, but enough to spark something he'd thought dead forever. Not hope exactly, but its shadow, a whisper of possibility. He began studying the river's patterns with new purpose. High water loosened posts. Low water exposed the base. Extreme temperatures stressed the metal. The cage, seemingly eternal, fought its own battle with time and elements. Perhaps, given enough seasons, the river would win. This thought became his new madness, not planning escape, which required hope he couldn't summon, but simply observing the slow war between water and iron. He became a scholar of erosion, an expert in metal fatigue. The river was patient. It had carved valleys and moved mountains. What was one iron cage against such persistence? The guards noticed nothing. To them, he remained the same broken creature, scarred and silent, more corpse than man. They didn't see the new attention in his eyes when floods came, didn't notice how he positioned himself to feel every structural vibration during storms. The river had taught him its greatest lesson. Power lay not in strength but in persistence, not in fighting, but in outlasting. Years passed, 9, 10, perhaps more. The cage endured, but barely. Rust bloomed across bars like orange flowers. Welds showed stress fractures, posts shifted minutely with each flood. The river continued its patient work, while he watched, waited, and witnessed the slow promise of geology against human cruelty. The early years brought desperate resistance. His merchant's hands, soft from handling silken herbs, bloodied themselves against iron bars. He tested every joint, every weld, every possible weakness with methodical determination. The cage revealed nothing but his own futility. His first escape attempt came during a guard change. New soldiers, unfamiliar with procedures, left his feeding slot unlocked after throwing in moldy rice. He spent hours contorting his body, trying to force his shoulder through the narrow opening. The slot was designed precisely wide enough for a bowl, far too narrow for human escape. He dislocated his shoulder in the attempt, the sound of separation audible above the river's flow. The guards found him unconscious from pain, reset his shoulder roughly, and welded additional bars across the slot. The second attempt used patience. Instead of force, a sharp stone washed up during spring floods. He hid it beneath his body, spending months grinding against a single bar during night hours. The work was agonizing. The cage's position made leverage impossible, and his chains limited movement to mere inches. After a year, he'd worn a groove barely thumb deep. The bar remained solid. The stone crumbled to dust. The intelligence failed where strength had. He tried psychological manipulation, pretending catatonia for weeks until guards grew careless. When one leaned too close, he grabbed for the keyring at his belt, but malnutrition had stolen his speed. The guard's rifle but left him semi-conscious for days, his jaw never properly healing. The punishment for escape attempts escalated. First, they reduced his already meager rations. Then came beatings, methodical, careful not to kill but designed to discourage. They shortened his chains until movement became torture. They threw buckets of river water over him in winter, let him bake without shade in summer. Each attempt brought new refinements to his suffering. His fourth attempt nearly succeeded through pure chance. Floods undermined one corner post, while guards sheltered from torrential rain. The cage tilted dramatically, bars bending under structural stress. For a moment, a gap appeared perhaps wide enough for his emaciated frame. He threw himself against the opening, chains catching on bent metal, skin tearing on rust. Then the post settled deeper, the gap closing like a mouth. Guards found him, trapped between bars, nearly bisected by the cage's weight. They reinforced all posts with concrete. After that, Taut hope died gradually, measured in failed attempts and accumulated punishments. His fifth try used a flood-delivered piece of metal to pick the lock it broke off in the mechanism, making the lock even more secure. The sixth involved weeks of vomiting to appear dying, hoping they'd open the cage to check. They didn't. The seventh was pure rage. A berserk assault on the bars that left him broken-fingered and defeated. That by the eighth year, physical escape transformed into mental flight. When reality offered no exit, he created his own. His mind wandered paths his body couldn't follow. He spent days in his childhood home, helping his father in the workshop, learning to plane wood, smooth as water. He traveled his merchant routes, in reverse, visiting each village in perfect detail, conducting business with ghosts. The most elaborate escapes happened at night. In dreams, the cage dissolved like morning mist. He walked free under stars he'd forgotten existed, following roads that led always home. Shaoli waited at the gate, unchanged by time. His children ran to greet him, still young, still innocent, of their father's fate. He awoke from these dreams weeping soundlessly. The transition back to iron reality, a fresh torture each time. Gradually, even mental escape became difficult. Memories faded like old silk, colors bleaching out, details disappearing. He couldn't recall Xiaoli's voice, though he remembered she sang. Lin's face blurred with other village boys. Only Mei remained clear, perhaps because he still clutched the pouch containing her hair. The fabric long rotted, but the hair somehow enduring. The final escape attempt wasn't planned. During his 10th winter, pneumonia filled his lungs with fluid. Fever brought visions of release, not through open doors, but through death's mercy. He stopped eating, stopped drinking, stopped fighting the infection consuming him. Guards watched indifferently. Natural death wasn't their concern, but his body, conditioned by years of impossible survival, refused surrender. The fever broke. His lungs cleared. He found himself still caged, still breathing, still inexplicably alive. The revelation brought neither relief nor despair, an empty recognition that even death required permission he couldn't grant. After that, escape transformed into something unrecognizable, not seeking freedom, just studying the cage's slow decay. Rust advanced like careful calligraphy across iron. Concrete cracked in freeze-thaw cycles. Metal fatigued under constant stress. He became an observer of entropy, noting each tiny victory of time over human construction. The guards interpreted his stillness as final defeat. They reported the prisoner pacified, no longer requiring close watch. Security relaxed. Shift changes grew sloppy. Sometimes they forgot feeding for days. He survived on rainwater and insects, requiring so little that existence itself became a form of escape from need, from hope, from human connection. Local children grew into adults, telling stories of the cage ghosts who tried to escape through the bars and got stuck forever, his spirit trapped between worlds. They were more right than wrong. He existed in a space between life and death, between human and creature, between sanity and madness. The ultimate escape, he realized, was accepting there was no escape. Yet still, in the deepest part of night, when the rivers sang old songs and stars reflected in the water like scattered promises, something in him refused complete surrender. Not hope, that word held no meaning. Not planning, his mind could no longer form such concepts. Just a wordless attention to the river's patient work against stone and metal. The eternal conflict between permanence and change. The cage would outlast him, but perhaps the river would outlast the cage. In that thought lay not escape, but a strange, terrible peace. Time moved differently in the cage. Years blurred together, seasons became indistinguishable. Guards changed faces but never purpose. The man who had been Wei Ming's no longer thought in terms of past or future. There was only the eternal present, of endurance, marked by the river's flow and the sky's passage overhead. Then came the forgetting. First, the guards stopped maintaining their logs. The leather-bound book where they recorded his condition, his suicide attempts, his daily degradation, gathered dust in the checkpoint shelter. New recruits weren't told why they watched the cage, only that they must. The original orders, signed by Lord Chen himself, disappeared into bureaucratic archives. The warlord himself had died 3 winters ago. Was it 4? The man in the cage knew only because the guards wore mourning bands and spoke of power, struggles in the distant compound. Lord Chun's son inherited control but cared nothing for his father's elaborate punishments. He had modern weapons to maintain power, not medieval cages. Without clear orders, the guards' vigilance faded. Where once 3 men monitored the cage in shifts, now a single soldier dozed at the checkpoint. Where detailed records tracked every aspect of imprisonment, now days passed without notation. The prisoner became furniture, background, responsibility. Without purpose, the local villagers forgot faster. Children who once threw stones grew into adults who hurried past without looking. New residents assumed the cage was historical, a monument to crueler times, not realizing its occupants still breathed. Merchants set up stalls nearby during market days, conducting business within sight of suffering. Blind to what had become invisible through familiarity, stories replaced memory. The cage spawned legends that bore no resemblance to truth. Some said it held a demon that would escape if the lock ever opened. Others claimed a holy man had voluntarily imprisoned himself for the world's sins. Young lovers met near the cage, at night, thrilling at their bravery, never noticing the eyes that watched from within shadows. The most fantastic tale came from traveling storytellers. They sang of a merchant who'd discovered immortality, herbs, and been caged by jealous lords, who tortured him for the secret. In their version, he would outlive his captors, outlive the cage itself, emerging centuries later to reclaim his treasure. The man inside heard these stories during festival nights, understanding that mythology was replacing history. That way Ming's had vanished more thoroughly than if he'd died. Official memory proved shortest. Regional inspectors stopped including the cage in reports. Tax collectors assessed the checkpoint but not its purpose. When provincial administrators updated criminal justice codes, no one remembered to check if old sentences still applied. The cage existed in legal limbo, neither pardoned nor confirmed, simply forgotten. A new magistrate arrived in the district, young and educated in the capital. He reviewed local records, trying to understand his jurisdiction. Finding references to the cage, he assumed they were historical, from the warlord era before proper government. When he visited the checkpoint on routine inspection, guards told him the cage was empty. Had been for years. He never looked closely enough to see otherwise. The forgetting spread like slow disease. Supply officers stopped allocating prisoner rations, guards shared their own food or forgot entirely. Medical inspections ceased. The monthly reports to provincial headquarters dwindled to quarterly, then yearly, then stopped. The cage vanished from official existence while still standing solid on the riverbank. Even the guards forgot their purpose. They knew they watched the cage but couldn't articulate why. When pressed, they invented reasons. It was haunted, it was historical preservation, it was tradition. New recruits weren't told about the occupant discovering him yourself became a rite of passage, a shock that faded to indifference within weeks. The man inside observed this vanishing with detached fascination. He'd become invisible through stillness, silent through necessity, forgotten through persistence. When children played near the cage, they looked through him. When officials inspected, they saw empty bars. He'd achieved the impossible, existing while ceasing to exist. Language abandoned him completely during this period. Not just speech, the very concept of words dissolved. He thought in images, sensations, the rhythm of water and wind. When he tried to remember his name, only shapes came, meaningless sounds that might have been Wei or Ming, or nothing at all. The pouch of hair in his hand meant something profound. But what? Daughter, wife, family? These concepts required words he no longer possessed. Physical invisibility accompanied mental dissolution. His skin, darkened by exposure and dirt, blended with shadows. His stillness mimicked death so perfectly that birds perched on his shoulders. His breathing was so shallow that frost barely formed on winter mornings. Guards glancing at the cage saw shapes that might be rags, debris, tricks of light, anything but human. The checkpoint itself deteriorated. Paint peeled from buildings, roof tiles slipped, letting rain through. The road, once maintained for military patrols, grew rough with neglect. Budget cuts eliminated night shifts. During storms, guards abandoned posts entirely. The cage stood, unwatched for hours, days, sometimes weeks, yet habits persisted past memory. Guards still threw food through bars, though they couldn't say why. Villagers still avoided the cage at night, though they'd forgotten what they feared. Children still dared each other to approach, though the danger was myth. Ritual outlasted, reason. In his 12th year of years, still had meaning. Something unprecedented happened. A guard, drunk on rice wine, decided to oil the ancient lock. Maintenance, he slurred, though no one had ordered it. As he worked, he noticed movement inside the cage. Squinting through alcohol haze, he saw what others had trained themselves to ignore. "There's someone in there," he said, astonished. His partner laughed. Everyone knew the cage was empty, had been for decades. The drunk guard insisted, eventually convincing others to look at what they'd stopped seeing. The shock rippled through the checkpoint. How long had he been there? Who was he? Why? But finding no answers in rotted records or faded memories, they did what humans do with uncomfortable truths. They looked away again. Within days, the prisoner faded back to invisibility. The drunk guard, sobered and embarrassed, claimed he'd seen shadows. Order restored itself through denial. The man in the cage understood. He'd transcended suffering into something else, a ghost haunting his own body, a legend living past his story's end. The world had forgotten Wei Ming so completely that even discovery couldn't restore his existence. He was the space between bars, the shadow in the corner, the silence where a scream should be. He was forgotten, and in that forgetting found the strangest freedom of all. The spring arrived different from all others. The man in the cage felt it first in his bones, an ache deeper than usual, a resonance with something building far upstream. Birds fled earlier than normal. The river carried strange debris. Furniture, whole trees with roots intact. The bloated carcass of livestock from regions that shouldn't flood. For weeks, rain fell in the mountains. Not the usual spring showers, but torrential downpours that turned streams to rivers, rivers to raging torrents. The water rose steadily, inch by inch, day by day. Local farmers moved possessions to higher ground. Fishermen pulled boats far up the banks. Everyone knew this would be bad, though none guessed how bad. The guards grew nervous. The checkpoint, built on a small rise, had never flooded in memory. But the river crept closer, angry and brown with silt. They received orders to evacuate records and weapons. No one mentioned the cage. In the confusion of preparation, the prisoner became even more invisible than usual. He watched the waters approach with emotions too complex for his wordless mind. Fear mixed with fascination, dread tangled with hope. The river had been his only companion for so long that its moods felt like extensions of himself. Now it rose with purposeful fury, as if answering years of whispered conversations. On the night the real flooding began, the last guard abandoned his post. The rain fell so hard it hurt, drops hitting like pebbles. Lightning illuminated a transformed landscape, the familiar riverbank gone, replaced by an endless expanse of churning water. Thunder shook the cage, rattling bars that had stood firm. For over a decade, the water reached the cage's base at midnight. By dawn, it swirled around the platform. By noon, it lapped at his feet. Cold shocked through his system. Not the familiar cold of winter, but something alive, electric with movement. The river had finally come to visit. S water rose past his ankles, past his knees. Panic flickered through his deadened nervous system. Drowning was the one death the cage couldn't prevent. His chains, shortened by years of punishment, wouldn't allow him to climb higher. He could only sit and wait as water claimed him inch by inch. But something else happened as the flood rose. The cage, solid for so long, began to groan. Water pressure pushed against bars from all directions. The platform beneath him shifted. Corner posts, their concrete bases undermined by current, started to lean. Metal shrieked against metal in sounds he'd never heard before. When water reached his chest, breathing became labor. Waves slapped his face, filling his mouth with muddy water. He coughed, sputtered, felt his body fighting for survival despite his mind's acceptance of death. Then a massive tree trunk, carried by the current, slammed into the cage. The impact shook the entire structure. Bars bent inward. Welds weakened by years of rust, cracked audibly. The tree, caught in the current, became a battering ram, hitting again and again. Each impact brought new sounds of structural failure. The man felt the cage dying around him. Metal that had trapped him for 13 years, or was it 14, finally met its match. Not human hands or tools, but the patient river fulfilling its wordless promise. Water and wood against iron, nature against human cruelty. A corner post snapped. The cage tilted dramatically, dunking him underwater. He held his breath, chains preventing him from finding air. This was the end. Then, drowning in the cage, claimed by his only friend, there was poetry in it. If he'd remembered what poetry was. But the tilt continued. The broken post let that corner drop completely. Bars designed to stay parallel twisted into new configurations. Gaps appeared not large, but larger than ever before. The tree struck again, and a weld split completely. A bar fell away, clanging against others as it dropped. He surfaced, gasping. The gap called to him, perhaps 2 feet wide where the bar had been. His chains still held him to the cage's center, but the tilting had given slack. Could he reach it? His muscles atrophied beyond recognition, screamed as he moved. Joints frozen by years of confinement cracked audibly. The water rose higher, lifting him, giving buoyancy to limbs that couldn't support themselves. He pulled toward the gap, chains cutting deeper into permanent grooves. The opening seemed both infinitely far and tantalizingly close. Another tree struck, widening the gap by precious inches. Lightning illuminated his struggle. In that frozen moment, he saw himself clearly, a skeletal figure fighting against chains in a drowning cage. Hair streaming like water weeds, eyes reflecting desperate animation after years of emptiness. He was human again, driven by the most basic instinct, survival. The chains caught on bent bars. He pulled, feeling skin tear, tendons strain. The water rose to his chin. Soon, there would be no air, no chance. With strength summoned from reserves he didn't know existed, he twisted his body in ways that hadn't moved in years. Joints popped, muscles tore. But inch by inch, he moved toward the gap. His shoulder reached the opening first. He forced it through, feeling bars scrape against protruding bones. His head followed, then his chest. The chains tangled, caught, held him half in, half out. Water covered his face. His lungs burned. This was death. Finally, caught between freedom and imprisonment. Then, the entire cage shifted. The second corner post failed, concrete crumbling under the assault. The structure folded in on itself, bars scissoring together. But the movement loosened his chains just enough. He pulled once more, felt something give way, and suddenly he was through outside the bars for the first time in 13 years. The current took him immediately. Weak beyond description, he could only surrender to its power. The cage, still collapsing, disappeared behind him. He tumbled through liquid darkness, sometimes under, sometimes breaking surface for desperate breaths. His body, so long confined, didn't remember how to swim, but it remembered how to survive. The flood carried him like debris, just another piece of wreckage in its vast collection. He struck submerged obstacles, caught on branches, spun in eddies. Each impact brought pain that proved he was alive, free, impossibly beyond the bars. The river that had witnessed his imprisonment now orchestrated his escape. As dawn broke, he found himself caught in the branches of a partially submerged tree, miles from the cage. The rain had stopped. The water, while still high, had calmed. He clung to his wooden raft, looking back toward where his prison had stood. Nothing remained visible but water stretching to the horizon, all landmarks erased. Wei Ming's was dead, had been for 13 years. But something survived, carried by flood from one existence to another. What that something would become, whether man or ghost or something between, remained unwritten. For now, there was only the tree, the water, and the impossible fact of freedom. The river had kept its promise. The cage was gone. And he, whatever he was, remained. The tree held him through the night. His fingers, twisted into claws by years of confinement, locked onto branches with desperate strength. The flood continued its rampage around him, carrying the wreckage of entire villages. Houses floated past, like boats. Dead animals bumped against his refuge. The water was thick with mud, cold with mountain snowmelt, alive with destructive power. When dawn came, it revealed a transformed world. The landscape he'd memorized from his cage was gone, replaced by an inland sea. Trees showed only their crowns. Hills became islands. The current had carried him far from any landmark he recognized. For someone who'd seen the same view for 13 years, this disorientation was profound. His body began failing as adrenaline faded. Muscles accustomed to minimal movement cramped viciously in the cold water. His joints, frozen in cage positions for so long, screamed at being extended. The grooves where chains had rested bled freely. The water around him tinged pink. Without the chain's familiar weight, he felt paradoxically unbalanced. The tree snagged on something underwater, perhaps a building, perhaps another tree. The jolt nearly dislodged him. He pulled himself higher, trying to escape the water's direct flow, but his arms had no strength. He could only cling and endure, just as he'd done in the cage. But now, with current trying to reclaim him, through the day, the water slowly receded. The rain had stopped, and the flood, having spent its fury, began its retreat. Land emerged like islands, first hilltops, then slopes, then fields covered in debris. His tree settled into mud as water dropped, tilting at an angle that made holding on even harder. By afternoon, he could see people. Flood survivors picked through wreckage on distant hills, searching for family, possessions, anything salvageable. They moved like ants, focused on their own disasters. None looked toward the tree where he clung. He tried to call out, but produced only rasps. His voice, unused for years, couldn't remember how to carry. The sun beat down, adding new misery. His skin, pale where clothing had covered it, burned quickly. Thirst replaced cold as primary torment. He was surrounded by water, but knew drinking the polluted flood would bring disease. His weakened body couldn't fight. Iron bars had been replaced by different prisons' weakness, exposure, isolation. As evening approached, the water dropped enough that his tree touched ground. He tried to dismount but collapsed immediately. His legs, bent in the cage for over a decade, wouldn't straighten properly. He crawled through mud that sucked at his limbs, each movement a monumental effort. 20 feet from the tree, he could go no further. He lay in the mud, feeling earth beneath him for the first time since his imprisonment began. Even polluted and debris-strewn, it felt miraculous. He pressed his face into it, tasting soil, feeling texture that wasn't iron or flesh. The simple act of lying flat impossible in the cage brought such relief he wept without sound. Night found him there, half buried in mud, indistinguishable from flood debris. The temperature dropped. Without water's buoyancy, his body felt impossibly heavy. He'd escaped the cage only to die of exposure. There was irony in that, if he'd remembered what irony meant. But survival instincts, honed by impossible years, wouldn't let him surrender. He forced himself to move, crawling toward higher ground. Progress was measured in feet, sometimes inches. Debris provided handholds: a broken door, a fence post, the corpse of a water buffalo. He pulled himself over obstacles that would have been nothing to a healthy person but were mountains to him. Near midnight, exhaustion stopped him beside a partially collapsed storage shed. The structure offered minimal shelter, but after years exposed to elements, even a broken roof felt luxurious. He dragged himself inside, disturbing rats that fled squeaking. In the corner, miraculously dry, lay empty rice sacks. He pulled them over himself, meager protection, but more than he'd had in memory. Sleep came in waves, interrupted by cramps and nightmares. He dreamed of the cage reformed around him, bars growing from earth like iron trees. He woke gasping, feeling for barriers that weren't there. The absence of confinement was its own terror. Without walls defining his space, the world felt impossibly vast. Dawn brought voices. A family of flood refugees had found the same shelter. They entered carefully, checking for hazards, and found him curled in the corner. Their gasps told him how he must look: skeletal, scarred, more creature than human. The children hid behind their mother while the father approached with a stick, unsure if he faced man or demon. He tried to speak, to explain, but only croaks emerged. He held up empty hands, showing he meant no harm, though the gesture revealed wrists worn to bone by shackles. The family conversed rapidly in dialect he recognized but couldn't fully understand. Finally, the woman pushed past her husband, maternal instinct overcoming fear. She knelt beside him, studying his condition with practical eyes. Her words were gentle, questioning. He couldn't respond verbally, but nodded when she asked if he needed help. She called to her children, sending the eldest for water from their meager supplies. The father remained wary but didn't interfere. The first sip of clean water burned like fire. His throat, used to catching rain and eating insects, had forgotten how to swallow properly. The woman helped him drink slowly, patiently, as she would a sick child. The water revived something in him, not strength but awareness. He was free, he was alive, he was human, despite everything. The family shared their story through gestures and simple words he gradually understood. Their village was gone. They sought relatives in the provincial capital. They had little but would share what they could. The human kindness, after years of cruelty or indifference, overwhelmed him. He wept again, silently, while the woman patted his shoulder with calloused hands. They helped him stand, supporting him between father and eldest son. His legs still wouldn't straighten fully, but they could bear some weight. They fashioned a walking stick from flood debris. Progress was slow, painful, but it was movement beyond the cage's confines. Each step took him further from 13 years of imprisonment. The landscape they traversed bore no resemblance to his memories. The flood had rewritten geography, erasing old landmarks, creating new ones. Roads were gone, replaced by channels of mud. Bridges had vanished, leaving only broken approaches. They picked their way through devastation, joining other refugees in a slow exodus toward higher ground. By evening, they reached a relief station established by provincial authorities. Tents housed hundreds of flood survivors. Medical personnel moved between groups, treating injuries. Food distribution centers provided rice, porridge. It was chaos, but organized chaos. Humanity, responding to disaster with compassion. The woman led him to medical tents, explaining to nurses through gestures and broken phrases that he needed help. The medical staff, overwhelmed by flood injuries, initially dismissed him as another casualty. Then they saw the scars, the deformities, the evidence of prolonged imprisonment. Their attitudes shifted from routine to shocked attention. A doctor examined him, cataloging injuries that told a story. Beyond flood survival, malnutrition, old breaks, healed, wrong, evidence of torture. The doctor asked questions he couldn't answer. Who did this? How long were you held? What was your crime? He could only shake his head, voiceless, memories locked behind years of wordless existence. The hospital in the provincial capital was a world beyond imagination. White walls, clean sheets, regular meals. After 13 years in an iron cage, these simple things felt like impossible luxuries. Nurses came and went on schedules he couldn't comprehend. Doctors examined him with instruments that seemed magical. He existed in a haze of medical attention and bewilderment. Dr. Liu, the chief physician, took special interest in his case. She documented each scar, each deformity, building a medical history from physical evidence. The groove marks from shackles, the curved spine from forced crouching, the evidence of multiple untreated fractures. Each examination revealed new horrors. that made even experienced medical staff pause. "Can you write?" Dr. Liu asked during one session, offering paper and pen. His claw-like hands couldn't grip properly. The marks he made were meaningless scrawls. "Can you speak at all?" He tried, producing only whispers that might have been words. Language remained locked somewhere his conscious mind couldn't reach. Physical therapy began immediately. A young therapist named Chen worked to straighten his legs, extend his arms, restore basic mobility. Each session was agony. Joints frozen for over a decade protested every movement. Muscles had to relearn functions they'd forgotten. Progress was measured in millimeters, in degrees of extension, in steps that looked more like shuffles. Nutrition proved equally challenging. His digestive system, adapted to insects and contaminated water, rejected normal food. They started with rice water, thin broths, gradually building to solid food. His body, starved for so long, couldn't process abundance. Weight gain was slow, marked by setbacks when his system simply shut down from overload. News of his case spread through medical channels to law enforcement. Inspector Wang arrived with a team of investigators, determined to uncover the truth. They showed him photographs, faces of local officials, images of cages, maps of the border regions. Did he recognize anything? Anyone? He stared at pictures that stirred something deep, but couldn't bridge the gap between recognition and communication. The breakthrough came accidentally. A nurse was humming while changing his bandage Eisen, old folk song about merchants and disting. Rhodes's hand moved suddenly, grasping hers. His mouth opened, and a word emerged. Cracked but unmistakable. The nurse froze. It was the first clear word he'd spoken. Shallowly she repeated, "Is that a name? Someone you know?" He nodded vigorously, tears streaming. Once the dam broke, other fragments followed. Mei Lin home. Words came slowly, painfully, like splinters being drawn from deep wounds. Each one cost enormous effort, but they came. Inspector Wang returned with genealogical records, census data, missing person reports from the border regions dating back 15 years. They found it eventually. A merchant named Wei Mings, reported missing 14 years ago by his wife Xiaoholi. The photograph was unrecognizable, showing a healthy man with clear eyes and straight back. But the details matched. Traveling medicine seller, 2 children, last seen heading to the eastern provinces. "Is this you?" Wang asked, showing the photograph. He studied the image of a stranger who might have been himself in another lifetime. Finally, he nodded. Wei Mings. The name felt foreign but stirred echoes of identity. He had been someone before. The cage had existed. The investigation intensified. Records showed Lord Chen had controlled the region where Mings disappeared. The warlord's death years ago had left a power vacuum, his cruel punishments becoming legend. Several cages were discovered along various riverbanks, all empty, their purposes forgotten. Mings had been the last occupant of a dying tradition of torture. Finding his family required delicate work. Xiaoli had remarried after 7 years, believing her husband dead. Chinese law was complex regarding such situations. She lived now in a distant province with her new family. Lin and Mei were adults. Lin worked as an accountant in Shanghai. Mei taught primary school near her mother. They had mourned their father and moved on. The authorities asked if he wanted them contacted. The question paralyzed him. What right did a ghost have to disturb the living? His children had grown without him. His wife had found new happiness. Wei Mings was dead to them should he remain so. He postponed the decision, focusing on the immediate challenge of recovery. Speech therapy joined his treatment regimen. Miss Zhou, patient and skilled, worked to rebuild his voice. They started with sounds, moved to syllables, gradually forming words. His vocal cords, damaged by years of silence and screaming, would never fully recover. His voice emerged as a whisper, hoarse and painful, but it was communication. Memory returned in fragments. Teaching Lin to count using dried beans. Mei's laughter when he brought her ribbons from market towns. Xiaoli singing while cooking, the scent of star anise and ginger filling their small kitchen. Each memory was joy and torture, combined proof of what he'd lost, what the cage had stolen. The media discovered his story. The Cage Man. Headlines screamed. 13 years of forgotten torture. Reporters clustered outside the hospital, seeking interviews he couldn't give. Human rights organizations demanded investigations. Politicians made speeches about justice and reform. He became a symbol without choosing to be one. Legal proceedings moved slowly. The men who'd imprisoned him were dead or scattered. No one could be prosecuted. The provincial government offered compensation money that meant nothing to someone who'd forgotten its purpose. They gave him identification documents for a man who barely remembered being human. Justice, he learned, was as abstract as freedom. When you'd lived beyond both. Physical recovery plateaued after 6 months. He could walk with a cane, speak in broken sentences, feed himself with adapted utensils. The deepest damage, the curved spine, the permanent joint damage, the neurological effects of prolonged torture would never fully heal. He was free but would carry the cage forever in his body. Psychological treatment proved even more complex. Dr. Feng, a trauma specialist, worked to address 13 years of unprocessed horror. But how could therapy touch what existed beyond language? He couldn't describe the texture of despair, the weight of forgotten years, the strange peace of accepting death while continuing to live. Some experiences transcended healing. The decision about his family came one night as rain fell outside his hospital window. The sound transported him not to the cage, but to the river that had saved him. Water had taken his freedom and returned it. Perhaps it was time to let currents carry him toward whatever remained of his former life. He asked Inspector Wang to contact them, not to reunite. He couldn't impose that burden, but to let them know he lived. They deserved the choice he'd never had. Whether they wanted to see him, whether they could accept what he'd become, would be their decision. He would accept any outcome. The cage had taught him that. The meeting was arranged for neutral ground, a tea house in the provincial capital, far from both his cage and their new lives. Inspector Wang offered to accompany him, but he chose to go alone. Some moments required solitude. Even after 13 years of enforced isolation, he arrived early, his body still announcing its history with every movement. The cane was necessary, the curved spine permanent, the scars visible despite long sleeves. Other patrons glanced and looked away, uncomfortable. With evidence of suffering, he found a corner table and waited, ordering tea he could barely taste. They entered together, Shaoli flanked by 2 adults. He should have recognized but didn't. Time had aged his wife gracefully. Silver touched her temples, laugh lines mapped. Years of life without him. Lin stood tall, serious, wearing the suit of a successful professional. Mei had her mother's eyes, but carried herself with confidence he'd never seen in his 4-year-old daughter. Recognition flickered in Zhao Li's eyes, followed by shock, grief, and something unreadable. She approached slowly, as if he might disappear. The children adults now hung back, uncertain. He tried to stand, but his body betrayed him. She gestured for him to remain seated. Ming's the name was a question, a prayer, an accusation. He nodded, unable to trust his damaged voice. She sat across from him, studying his transformed face, the evidence of unimaginable years. Her hand reached out, stopped, withdrew. The distance between them was measurable in more than space. "We thought you were dead," she said finally. "After 2 years, the authorities said. We had a funeral. I burned incense for your spirit." Her voice broke. "Where were you? What happened? Why didn't you?" The questions died as she saw the answers written on his body. He spoke carefully, each word an effort. Cage, river, 13 years. The shorthand of horror, inadequate to convey the reality. He showed his wrists where shackle marks would never fade. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by a grief so profound it transcended tears. Lin stepped forward, protective of his mother. "Why contact us now? We've built new lives. Mother remarried. We mourned you." Anger and confusion warred in his voice. The boy who'd tried to be man of the house had succeeded too well. May surprised them all. She moved past her brother, sitting beside her mother, studying him with teacher's eyes that assessed and accepted. "You're the man from the news." The cage. "Man? I didn't connect. We never knew your name." She turned to her mother. "He didn't abandon us. He was imprisoned, tortured." The story emerged in fragments. His arrest, the false accusation, the warlord's cruelty. He couldn't describe the years themselves, they existed beyond words. But he showed them the pouch, miraculously preserved, containing Mei's hair. She gasped, recognizing the cloth her mother had sewn. "You kept it," Shaoli whispered. "All those years?" He nodded. It had been his only anchor to humanity. Proof that Wei Ming's had existed, had been loved, had loved in return. The hair was brittle now, colorless, but it had survived. As had he. They talked through the afternoon. His voice failed frequently, requiring gestures and written words. They shared their own journey, the search, the hope, the gradual acceptance of loss. Zhao Li's remarriage to a kind man who'd raised his children well, Lin's education, his career, his own young family, Mei's path to teaching, inspired by memories of her father's patience. "I don't expect anything," he managed finally. "Just wanted you to know, to choose." The Kagi had taught him about choice, how precious it was, how it could be stolen, how it must be honored when offered. He wouldn't impose his survival on their rebuilt lives. Shaoli wept then. 13 years of suppressed grief flooding out. "We lit incense every year, told stories to keep you alive for them. And you were in that cage, and we didn't. No. Didn't search long enough. Didn't." He reached out with his damaged hand, touching hers briefly. "You lived," he said simply. "That's what I wanted. For you to live." The meeting ended without resolution. They needed time to process the resurrection of a man they'd buried in memory. He gave them his hospital contact, leaving the future in their hands. As they parted, Mei hugged him quickly, carefully, whispering, "I still have the jade stone, the shiny one you promised." He didn't remember the stone, but he held her briefly, marveling at the woman his butterfly had become. Recovery continued. He moved to a small apartment provided by a victim's compensation fund. Daily life required relearning, cooking, cleaning, existing without bars, defining space. He awoke often expecting iron above him, finding only ceiling. Freedom was its own challenge. He found work eventually, simple tasks his damaged body could manage. A temple needed someone to tend gardens, sweep paths, maintain the grounds. The monks asked no questions, accepting his silence, his scars, his need for solitude. He worked slowly but steadily, finding peace in routine that didn't involve survival. His family visited occasionally, not as the unit they'd been that was gone forever, but as individuals building new connections. Lin brought his children, introducing them to a grandfather they'd never expected. Mei shared her teaching experiences, finding parallels in patience and endurance. Shaoli came alone sometimes, sitting quietly, bridging past and present with presence rather than words. The river called him back eventually, not the scene of his imprisonment. That place was transformed, the cage removed, the checkpoint demolished. But the river itself remained, eternal and indifferent. He stood on a different bank, upstream from memory, watching water that had witnessed everything and remembered nothing. He spoke to it sometimes, as he had during the cage years, not seeking answers or meaning, just acknowledging their shared history. The river had been his jailer, his companion, his savior. It had taken his freedom and returned it transformed. The metaphor was too obvious to voice life as river, flowing, despite obstacles, finding ways around or through barriers. A small shrine stood near this spot, dedicated to water spirits and forgotten gods. He left offerings, sometimes flowers, incense, rice wine poured into the current. Not prayer exactly, but recognition. The river had taught him about time, about persistence, about the strange mercy of survival. On anniversary days his imprisonment, his escape, his rediscovery, he returned to the water. His reflection showed a stranger, scarred, bent, aged beyond years, but alive. Impossibly alive. The cage existed now only in his body and dreams. The river flowed on, carrying his gratitude and grief together downstream. He built a quiet life from fragments, not the life stolen, but something new. He helped other victims of injustice when he could, his survival proof that endurance was possible. He wrote simple accounts of his experience for human rights organizations, testimony in broken sentences that carried weight through understatement. The nightmares never fully stopped. Iron bars grew from earth in his dreams, water rose to drown. Hymn chains materialized from shadow, but morning always came, bringing freedom's strange burden. He'd learned that survival wasn't triumph, it was simply continuation. One day following another, like water flowing despite all obstacles. In the end, the river's gift wasn't freedom that had been taken and returned to damage to recognize. The gift was simpler, the knowledge that some things endure. Water wears down stone, time dissolves iron, and sometimes, against all probability, life persists through circumstances that should destroy it. He was proof of that persistence. Marked by it, defined by it, strangely grateful for it. The river flowed. He lived beside it. Both of them carried histories too deep for words, moving always forward, shaped by their channels but not contained by them. It was enough. After years in a cage, it was more than enough. It was everything.